They snickered when I walked into Margot's Culinary Academy carrying my worn piping bag. Chen, the real estate agent with perfectly manicured nails, whispered something to her friend about amateur hour. Even the instructor, Chef Bernard, barely glanced at my simple buttercream roses before moving on to praise the elaborate sugar flowers the other students had crafted. But 3 hours later, when Master Pâtissier Dubois walked through those kitchen doors and made his announcement, the entire room went silent. The same people who had rolled their eyes at my basic techniques suddenly realized they were standing next to someone they couldn't afford to ignore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Margot's Culinary Academy cast everything in that harsh, institutional glow that makes even the most beautiful cake look like it belongs in a hospital cafeteria. I pushed through the glass doors at exactly 7:55, 5 minutes before the advanced cake decorating workshop was scheduled to begin. My hands gripped the handles of my canvas tote bag, the one that had seen better days, filled with my personal tools and a small notebook where I kept my recipe modifications. I wasn't supposed to be nervous. After 15 years of working with buttercream, fondant, and royal icing, muscle memory should have taken over the moment I stepped into any professional kitchen. But this wasn't just any kitchen, and these weren't just any students. This was the kind of place where hobbyists came to pretend they were professional bakers, where corporate executives spent their weekends learning to pipe roses they'd never use, and where everyone seemed to have more money than sense. The other 12 students had already claimed their stations, spreading out their equipment like they were setting up for a photo shoot rather than a learning experience. Chen, who I'd met briefly during registration, had arranged what looked like a mobile cake decorating studio across her workspace. Professional-grade offset spatulas in 3 different sizes, a complete set of Admiral tips still in their original packaging, and a digital scale that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Next to her, Amanda Rodriguez was organizing her supplies with the kind of precision that suggested she'd watched too many baking competition shows. Color-coordinated gel food coloring arranged by hue, piping bags lined up like surgical instruments, and a tablet propped up showing what appeared to be a Pinterest board titled Advanced Techniques Masterclass. I found the only remaining station, tucked into the back corner near the industrial dishwasher. The overhead light flickered occasionally, casting intermittent shadows across the stainless steel workspace. I unpacked my tools methodically, the same way I'd been doing for over a decade. My piping bag, softened from years of use but still perfectly functional. My offset spatula, the handle worn smooth from countless hours of smoothing buttercream. My tips, a modest collection of essentials that I knew better than my own reflection. The other students were already deep in conversation, voices carrying that particular blend of enthusiasm and competitiveness that marked people who were used to being the best at everything they tried. Sarah was explaining her background in interior design and how she planned to incorporate those principles into her cake work. Amanda mentioned her food blog and the thousands of followers who were waiting to see what she'd learned today. I arranged my notebook parallel to the edge of my workspace, opened to a fresh page, and wrote the date at the top in my usual compact script. Old habits from years of documenting every technique, every modification, every lesson learned through trial and error in kitchens that demanded perfection on the first attempt. Chef Bernard made his entrance at exactly 8 o'clock, striding into the room with the kind of theatrical flair that cooking show hosts perfect over years of practice. Mid-50s, silver hair swept back in a style that probably required more product than most people used in a week, wearing chef's whites so pristine they looked like they'd never been within 10 feet of actual food preparation. He surveyed the room with the expression of someone evaluating livestock at auction, his gaze lingering on the more impressive displays of equipment before sliding past my corner station as if it were part of the furniture. When he spoke, his accent carried just enough French inflection to sound authentic without being incomprehensible, the kind of carefully cultivated persona that worked well for teaching wealthy hobbyists. Welcome to Advanced Cake Decorating, where we separate the artists from the amateurs. Today, we'll be focusing on classical French buttercream techniques and architectural sugar work. I expect precision, creativity, and above all, a commitment to excellence that befits this establishment. He moved through the room, stopping at each station to examine the students' preparations. At Sarah's workspace, he nodded approvingly at her extensive tool collection. At Amanda's station, he spent several minutes discussing her color theory background and how it would translate to edible artistry. When he reached my corner, his inspection lasted approximately 3 seconds. He glanced at my simple setup, made a notation on his clipboard, and continued his circuit without comment. The message was clear enough. I was here to fill a seat and pay tuition, not to contribute anything meaningful to the learning experience. The lesson began with a demonstration of classical buttercream preparation, the kind of foundational skill that separates professional work from home kitchen experiments. Chef Bernard explained the importance of temperature control, the precise ratio of butter to sugar, and the technique for achieving the perfect consistency that would hold elaborate piping work without breaking down under pressure. As he worked, I found myself mentally comparing his method to the one I'd learned years ago in a kitchen that operated under very different constraints. His approach was technically correct, designed for optimal visual results in controlled conditions. But I'd learned modifications that worked better when you needed consistency across large batches, when you had to account for temperature variations, and when failure simply wasn't an option. I raised my hand slightly, the gesture automatic after years of participating in professional briefings and training sessions. Chef Bernard, regarding the egg white temperature, wouldn't a slightly cooler start give you more stability for extended decorating work? He paused in his demonstration, looking at me with the kind of expression reserved for students who ask questions that reveal they haven't been paying attention. Mademoiselle, the classical method has been perfected over generations. We're not here to reinvent tradition. A few soft chuckles rippled through the room. Sarah exchanged a knowing look with Amanda, the kind of silent communication that said they'd been right about the amateur in the corner. I simply nodded and made a note in my book, the same way I'd been documenting corrections and alternative approaches for over 15 years. The demonstration continued with piping techniques, starting with basic rosettes and building toward more complex flower work. Chef Bernard's hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating perfect spiral roses that looked like they belonged in a high-end bakery display case. As he worked, he explained the wrist positioning, pressure control, and the subtle movements that created the illusion of natural petals. When it came time for hands-on practice, the room filled with the focused concentration of people determined to prove they belonged in an advanced class. I prepared my buttercream using the temperature modification I'd mentioned earlier, a technique that would give me more working time and better consistency for detailed work. My first rose took shape under steady pressure, each petal building on the last with the kind of smooth motion that comes from thousands of repetitions. The flower that emerged wasn't as visually dramatic as some of the others taking shape around the room, but the structure was sound, the petals properly layered, and the overall form balanced in a way that would photograph well from any angle. Sarah, working at the station next to mine, was struggling with her buttercream consistency. Her roses kept collapsing as she tried to add the outer petals, the buttercream too soft to hold the elaborate spiral pattern she was attempting. She muttered something under her breath about the room temperature affecting her mixture. I glanced at her work and could see the problem immediately. Her buttercream had been overmixed, breaking the emulsion just enough to compromise its structural integrity.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was fixable, but only if you knew the right technique to restabilize the mixture without starting from scratch. "Sarah," I said quietly, "if you pop that bowl in the freezer for about 90 seconds, then give it a quick whip, it should firm up enough to hold your pattern." She looked at me skeptically, clearly weighing whether advice from the amateur in the corner was worth following. "Thanks, but I think I'll just start over with a fresh batch." Around the room, other students were having varying degrees of success. Amanda's color work was impressive, gradients that flowed seamlessly from deep burgundy to pale pink. But her piping technique lacked the precision needed for professional quality flowers. A few other students had achieved technically competent results, though nothing that would distinguish their work from thousands of similar attempts posted on social media every day. Chef Bernard made his rounds, offering praise and corrections with the kind of measured feedback that kept students engaged without being too discouraging. At Sarah's station, he suggested she might benefit from more practice with basic consistency before attempting advanced techniques. At Amanda's workspace, he complimented her artistic vision while gently noting that technical execution needed to match creative ambition. When he reached my corner, he examined the half-dozen roses I'd completed while others were still struggling with their first attempts. Each flower was identical in structure, with clean petal definition and professional-level consistency. They weren't the most elaborate in the room, but they demonstrated a level of technical control that suggested significant experience. "Adequate," he said after a moment, making another notation on his clipboard. "Perhaps focus on developing more creative flair to complement your basic technique." The comment landed with just enough condescension to make it clear that adequate was not a compliment in this context. A few students glanced over at my work, then away again, satisfied that their initial assessment had been correct. The quiet woman in the corner might have decent technical skills, but she clearly lacked the artistic vision that separated true cake artists from mere decorators. I continued working, adding leaves and small accent flowers to create a more complete composition. As I worked, I found myself automatically calculating the ratios that would be needed to scale this design up for a larger production run. How many pounds of buttercream for 100 similar decorations? How long the piping process would take with multiple decorators working in parallel? What modifications would be needed to ensure consistency across different skill levels? These were the kinds of considerations that never occurred to hobbyists, but they became second nature when you'd spent years managing production schedules that had zero tolerance for artistic temperament and unlimited patience for technical perfection. The lesson moved on to sugar work, the delicate art of creating edible decorative elements that could elevate cake designs from competent to spectacular. Chef Bernard demonstrated the process of cooking sugar to the correct temperature, the techniques for pulling it into thin sheets, and the methods for shaping it into flowers, leaves, and architectural elements that looked more like glass sculptures than food. This was where the class truly separated into different skill levels. Sugar work required not just artistic vision, but an understanding of chemistry, temperature control, and precise timing that couldn't be faked or improvised. Several students struggled with the basic techniques, their sugar crystallizing before they could shape it or breaking apart when they tried to create delicate details. I prepared my sugar mixture, adjusting the temperature slightly based on the humidity in the room and adding a small amount of glucose that would give the final product more flexibility and longer working time. These were modifications I'd learned through necessity, adaptations that became essential when you couldn't control every environmental variable but still needed consistent results. My sugar flowers took shape with the kind of efficiency that comes from understanding the material at a molecular level. Petals thin enough to be translucent but strong enough to maintain their structure. Leaves with realistic texture created through controlled cooling rather than added tools. A complete floral spray that looked delicate but would actually hold up to transportation and handling better than most of the more elaborate attempts happening around the room. Chef Bernard paused at my station longer this time, examining the sugar work with more attention than he'd given my buttercream roses. The technical execution was clearly beyond what he'd expected from the quiet student in the corner, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Interesting approach," he said finally, though perhaps a bit conservative for advanced work. Conservative was clearly code for lacking in creativity, another polite way of suggesting that technical competence without artistic flair was ultimately unremarkable. I made another note in my book and continued working, adding small details that would demonstrate additional techniques without calling unnecessary attention to the process. As the 3-hour session moved toward its conclusion, students began arranging their work for the final critique, the traditional end-of-class evaluation where everyone could see what their classmates had accomplished. Display tables were set up at the front of the room, and students carefully transported their creations for group evaluation. Sarah's final composition was visually striking, with bold color choices and dramatic height that would photograph beautifully for social media. The technical issues with her buttercream were less obvious once everything was assembled, and her background in interior design showed in the overall aesthetic balance of the piece. Amanda's work demonstrated sophisticated color theory and artistic vision, even if some of the execution details revealed her relative inexperience with advanced techniques. Her sugar work was ambitious, attempting complex forms that didn't quite achieve their intended effect, but showed creative thinking and willingness to take risks. Other students had produced competent work that fell somewhere between technical adequacy and artistic aspiration, the kind of results that validated their investment in advanced training while making it clear they still had significant room for improvement. I arranged my work simply, focusing on clean presentation that would allow the technical details to speak for themselves. My composition wasn't the most visually dramatic in the room, but every element demonstrated precise control and professional-level consistency, the kind of work that might not win Instagram likes but would meet the standards of clients who expected perfection every time. Chef Bernard moved through the display tables, offering comments and critiques that balanced encouragement with constructive feedback. His approach was pedagogically sound, designed to maintain student engagement while providing actionable guidance for future improvement. When he reached my display, he spent longer examining the details than I'd expected. His trained eye could clearly see the level of technical control in both the buttercream work and the sugar artistry, even if the overall aesthetic was more reserved than some of the other attempts. "Solid technical foundation," he said finally. "With more focus on creative development, you could produce quite competitive work." It was the most positive feedback I'd received all evening, though still delivered with the kind of measured tone that made it clear he considered me a competent amateur rather than someone with significant professional experience. The other students were packing up their tools and discussing plans for future classes, their conversation filled with the enthusiasm of people who'd discovered a new passion and were eager to pursue it further. Several exchanged contact information, planning informal practice sessions and study groups that would extend the learning experience beyond the formal classroom setting. I cleaned my workspace with the methodical efficiency that had become automatic over the years, washing tools in the specific sequence that ensured everything would be properly maintained for future use. My notebook went back into my bag, along with my modest collection of piping tips and the offset spatula that had served me faithfully through countless projects. As I prepared to leave, Sarah approached with the kind of hesitant friendliness that suggested she was reconsidering her initial assessment of the quiet woman in the corner. "That was really helpful advice about the buttercream temperature," she said. "I ended up taking it after all, and it made a huge difference. Where did you learn that technique?" "Just picked it up over the years," I replied, shouldering my bag. "Trial and error, mostly." She nodded, clearly expecting more details that I wasn't inclined to provide. "Well, maybe we'll see you in the next level class. I think Chef Bernard is planning to cover wedding cake construction techniques." "Maybe," I said, though we both knew it was the kind of non-committal response that really meant probably not. I left Margot's Culinary Academy the same way I'd entered, quietly and without drawing attention to myself. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the evening students and the security lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. As I drove home through the city streets, I found myself thinking about the evening's experience, not with frustration or disappointment, but with the kind of detached analysis that had become my default mode for processing new situations. The other students weren't wrong to assume I was an amateur. Based on the information available to them, their assessment made perfect sense. They saw someone with modest equipment, simple techniques, and a conservative approach to artistic expression. They couldn't know that those choices were deliberate, refined through years of working in environments where reliability mattered more than creativity, where technical perfection was the baseline expectation rather than the ultimate goal. But tomorrow would bring different challenges, and the skills I demonstrated tonight in a Culinary Academy classroom would be applied in a context where the stakes were considerably higher than impressing fellow hobbyists, where the standards were set not by cooking show aesthetics, but by protocols that had been developed over decades to ensure absolute consistency and uncompromising quality. The quiet woman in the corner had been underestimated before. It was a familiar position and usually a temporary one. The second week of classes arrived with the same fluorescent harshness and the same collection of eager faces, though I noticed the dynamic had shifted slightly since our first session. Sarah had invested in even more equipment, her workspace now resembling a professional cake decorating supply catalog. Amanda had printed out what appeared to be architectural drawings of elaborate cake structures, complete with engineering notes about structural integrity and weight distribution. I took the same corner station, unpacking my tools with the same methodical precision that had marked every professional kitchen I'd worked in for the past 15 years. My notebook opened to a fresh page, date written in the same compact script, ready to document whatever techniques Chef Bernard would demonstrate today. The conversation around me had evolved from nervous introductions to confident discussions about technique and artistic vision. Several students had clearly spent the week practicing, their hands moving with slightly more assurance as they arranged their supplies. Sarah mentioned visiting 3 different specialty shops to find the perfect gel colorings for today's lesson. Amanda had reorganized her home kitchen to create a dedicated cake decorating space. Chef Bernard entered with his usual theatrical flair, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place at the center of attention. Today's lesson will focus on advanced structural techniques, he announced, the kind of engineering principles that separate ambitious home bakers from professionals capable of creating architectural marvels in sugar and flour. He began with a demonstration of internal support systems, showing how to properly install dowels and plates to support multiple tiers without compromising the cake's visual appeal. His explanations were technically accurate, though simplified for an audience that would primarily be working on single-occasion projects rather than production environments. As he worked, I found myself mentally calculating the modifications needed for larger-scale operations. The techniques he was demonstrating would work perfectly for a wedding cake serving 50 guests, but scaling up to serve 500 required different approaches to weight distribution, transportation logistics, and assembly timing. When he reached the section on ganache application for smooth finishes, I noticed he was using a technique that would produce beautiful results under ideal conditions but wouldn't hold up well to temperature variations or extended transport times. I raised my hand, with the same automatic gesture I'd used the previous week. Chef Bernard, for ganache work that needs to maintain stability over longer periods, wouldn't a slightly higher ratio of chocolate help prevent blooming issues? He paused, spatula suspended over his demonstration cake, and looked at me with the same expression of mild irritation he'd shown the week before. Mademoiselle, we're focusing on classical proportions that have been proven over time. The ratios I'm demonstrating are industry standard. Sarah glanced over from her station with what might have been sympathy mixed with secondhand embarrassment. Amanda made a note on her tablet, though whether she was recording the chef's technique or my interruption wasn't clear. The message was obvious enough that I simply nodded and returned to my own notebook, writing down both the classical ratio and the modification that would actually work better in real-world applications. The hands-on portion began with each student attempting to create a 2-tiered structure using the support techniques Chef Bernard had demonstrated. The room filled with the focused concentration of people determined to prove they'd absorbed the lesson, mixed with the underlying tension that came from working with techniques that offered very little margin for error. I prepared my cakes with the kind of systematic approach that had become automatic over the years, checking measurements twice, testing structural points before committing to final assembly, and working with the efficiency that came from understanding exactly how each component would behave under stress. My first tier went together smoothly, dowels positioned with mathematical precision, plates aligned to distribute weight evenly across the support structure. The second tier required more delicate work, balancing the visual appeal of the design with the practical requirements of stability and transportation. Around me, other students were experiencing varying degrees of success and frustration. Sarah's ambitious color gradients were visually stunning, but her structural work was compromised by her focus on aesthetic details at the expense of engineering principles. Her top tier showed a slight lean that would only get worse as the buttercream settled. Amanda's approach was more systematic, following Chef Bernard's instructions with careful precision, but her inexperience showed in the small details that separated competent amateur work from professional results. Her dowel placement was accurate, but not optimal, creating a structure that would hold together but wouldn't travel well. A few stations over, I could hear Janet Morrison, a retired teacher who'd mentioned this was her third attempt at advanced cake decorating, struggling with her ganache application. The mixture had seized, turning from smooth liquid chocolate into a grainy mess that couldn't be salvaged without starting completely over. Chef Bernard was making his rounds, offering guidance and corrections with his usual blend of encouragement and gentle superiority. At Sarah's station, he complimented her artistic vision while suggesting she might want to add additional support to prevent structural issues. At Amanda's workspace, he praised her methodical approach while noting that experience would help her develop more intuitive understanding of the techniques. When he reached my corner station, he spent longer examining my work than I'd expected. Both tiers were assembled with professional-level precision, the kind of structural integrity that suggested significant experience with large-scale cake construction. The ganache finish was mirror smooth, applied with a technique that would maintain its appearance even under less than ideal conditions. "Very competent work," he said after his examination, making his usual notation on the clipboard, "though perhaps you might experiment with more adventurous design elements to complement your technical abilities." It was the same feedback pattern as the previous week, acknowledgement of technical competence delivered with the implication that competence without creativity is ultimately unremarkable. I made my standard note and continued working, adding to corner decorative elements that demonstrated additional techniques without calling unnecessary attention to the process. The lesson continued with advanced piping work, focusing on the kind of intricate border designs and architectural details that elevated cake decorating from craft to art form. Chef Bernard demonstrated pressure control techniques for creating consistent patterns, the wrist movements that produced flowing lines, and the timing required to maintain uniform consistency across complex designs. As the other students attempted to replicate his demonstrations, I found myself automatically adjusting for the environmental factors that would affect real-world applications. The humidity in the room was affecting buttercream consistency in ways that would require minor technique modifications. The lighting made color matching more challenging than it would be under proper cake decorating illumination. These were the kinds of considerations that became second nature when you'd spent years working in environments where every detail mattered, where client expectations were non-negotiable, and where failure to account for seemingly minor variables could compromise an entire project. My piping work developed with the kind of smooth efficiency that came from thousands of hours of practice, each line flowing into the next with mechanical precision.
The patterns I created weren't the most elaborate in the room, but they demonstrated a level of control that suggested professional training rather than hobby enthusiasm. Janet, working at the station next to mine, was struggling with her pressure control, her borders coming out uneven and breaking at irregular intervals. She muttered something about her arthritis making the fine motor control more difficult than it used to be. I glanced at her work and could see that her grip was too tight, causing her hand to fatigue quickly and creating the pressure variations that were ruining her line work. It was an easy fix if you knew the right technique, a modification I'd learned from working with decorators who had similar issues. "Janet," I said quietly, "if you hold the bag a little higher and let gravity help with the pressure, it might be easier on your hands." She looked at me with surprise, then adjusted her grip according to my suggestion. Her next line came out significantly smoother, with better consistency and less visible strain in her posture. "Oh my goodness, that's so much better," she said, continuing the border with renewed confidence. "Where did you learn that technique?" "Just something I picked up over the years," I replied, returning to my own work. "Sometimes the old ways aren't the only ways." She nodded enthusiastically and continued working, her borders improving dramatically with the modified technique. Across the room, I noticed Chef Bernard watching our interaction with interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. As the evening progressed, the complexity of the techniques increased, moving from basic structural work to the kind of artistic flourishes that required not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision. Students were encouraged to develop their own creative interpretations of the classical methods, to find their personal voice within the established framework of professional cake decorating. This was where the class truly separated into different categories of ability and ambition. Some students thrived with the creative freedom, producing work that was visually stunning even if technically imperfect. Others struggled without the clear guidelines of step-by-step instruction, their natural caution preventing them from taking the artistic risks that would elevate their work above competent replication. I approached the creative portion with the same systematic methodology I applied to everything else, analyzing the available techniques and materials to determine the most effective combination for achieving specific visual goals. My design choices were informed by years of working within constraints that required maximum impact with minimal resources, where every decorative element had to justify its existence through both aesthetic and practical considerations. The composition that emerged from my efforts was understated but sophisticated, demonstrating technical mastery through restraint rather than excess. Each element served multiple purposes, contributing to both the visual appeal and the structural integrity of the overall design. It was the kind of work that would age well, maintaining its appearance and stability long after more ambitious attempts had begun to show their limitations. Chef Bernard made his final rounds as the session approached its conclusion, offering individual critiques and guidance for future development. His feedback was consistently constructive, designed to encourage continued learning while providing specific direction for improvement. When he reached my station for his final evaluation, he spent considerable time examining the details of my work, his trained eye clearly recognizing the level of control and planning that had gone into every decision. "Impressive technical execution," he said finally, though his tone carried a note of puzzlement that hadn't been present in his earlier assessments. "Your understanding of structural principles is quite advanced. Where did you develop this level of expertise?" "Self-taught, mostly," I replied, the same deflecting response I'd used with Janet and Sarah. "Lots of practice and experimentation." He nodded slowly, making what appeared to be more extensive notes than usual on his clipboard. I had the distinct impression that his assessment of the quiet student in the corner was undergoing some revision, though he kept his conclusions to himself. As students began cleaning their stations and discussing the evening's successes and challenges, the conversation carried a different energy than the previous week. Several people had clearly made significant progress, their confidence growing along with their technical abilities. Sarah approached my station as I was washing my tools, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity about the techniques I demonstrated. "That tip you gave Janet about the pressure control, that's not anything Chef Bernard covered in class. Do you have formal training somewhere else?" "Not formal, exactly," I said, drying my offset spatula with the same methodical care I applied to everything else. "Just picked up things along the way." She waited for more details that weren't coming, then shifted tactics. "Well, your work is really impressive, very professional looking. Have you ever thought about doing this commercially?" It was an innocent question, the kind of casual inquiry that people made when they were trying to place someone within their understanding of how skills and experience translated into career paths. She couldn't know that the question touched on aspects of my background that were significantly more complex than my simple answers suggested. "Just a hobby for now," I replied, packing my tools with the same efficiency I demonstrated throughout the evening. She nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation. Around us, other students were having similar conversations, sharing contact information and making plans for practice sessions between formal classes. Janet stopped by my station before leaving, her enthusiasm for the evening's breakthrough still evident in her voice and posture. "I can't thank you enough for that grip technique. I was about ready to give up on piping work entirely. You probably saved my cake decorating career before it even got started." "Happy to help," I said, shouldering my bag. "Sometimes a small adjustment makes all the difference." I left Margot's Culinary Academy for the second time, walking through the same glass doors into the same poorly lit parking lot. But something had shifted during the evening session, a subtle change in how the other students viewed the quiet woman in the corner. The dismissiveness was being replaced by curiosity, the casual disregard giving way to recognition that my technical abilities were significantly more advanced than my modest equipment and conservative approach initially suggested. It was a familiar progression, one I'd experienced in various contexts over the years. As I drove home through the city streets, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Janet, the way a simple technique modification had transformed her experience from frustration to success. It was a reminder of why I'd originally been drawn to teaching, the satisfaction that came from helping people discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. But tonight had also reminded me of the careful balance I'd learned to maintain, the art of being helpful without revealing too much, of demonstrating competence without calling attention to the full scope of my background and experience. Tomorrow would bring different challenges, ones that would require the same technical precision I demonstrated in Chef Bernard's classroom, but applied in a context where the stakes were considerably higher than impressing fellow hobbyists, where the standards were set not by culinary school aesthetics, but by protocols that demanded absolute perfection every single time. The quiet woman in the corner was becoming less invisible, but that was a temporary situation that would resolve itself soon enough. In professional kitchens, competence spoke louder than equipment, and experience mattered more than appearances. Some lessons couldn't be taught in classrooms, and some skills could only be developed through years of working where failure wasn't just disappointing, it was impossible.
But for now, I was content to let my classmates continue their gradual reassessment of the amateur in the corner, unaware that their assumptions were about to be challenged in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. The third week brought an unexpected change to our usual routine. Chef Bernard announced that we'd be joined by a special guest, someone whose expertise would elevate our understanding of professional cake decorating beyond the hobbyist level. The anticipation in the room was palpable as students speculated about which celebrity chef or Food Network personality might grace our little academy with their presence. Sarah had outdone herself with equipment preparation, her station now resembling a mobile bakery complete with a professional stand mixer and what appeared to be a complete set of European cake decorating tools. Amanda arrived with a portfolio of cake designs she'd been working on, photographs of elaborate creations that demonstrated her growing confidence and ambition. I settled into my familiar corner station, arranging my modest collection of tools with the same methodical precision that had marked every session. My notebook opened to a fresh page, ready to document whatever advanced techniques our mystery guest might demonstrate. The energy in the room was different tonight, charged with excitement and nervous anticipation. Students were arriving earlier, staying later, and the conversations carried an edge of competitiveness that hadn't been present during the first two sessions. Everyone wanted to make a good impression on whoever would be evaluating their progress. Janet had been practicing the pressure control technique I'd shown her, her confidence visibly improved as she arranged her piping bags with newfound assurance. Several other students had made noticeable progress, their movements more fluid and their results more consistent than they'd achieved in previous weeks. Chef Bernard seemed more animated than usual, his typical theatrical flair amplified by whatever significance he attributed to tonight's special guest. He spent extra time reviewing proper workspace organization and professional presentation standards, clearly wanting his students to reflect well on his teaching methods. We were midway through his demonstration of advanced sugar pulling techniques when the door opened without the usual courtesy knock or announcement. The man who entered carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made the room's energy shift immediately, conversations trailing off as heads turned to assess this unexpected arrival. He was perhaps 60 years old, wearing chef's whites that had the lived-in quality of someone who spent their days actually cooking rather than teaching. His hands showed the kind of wear that came from decades of professional kitchen work, and his eyes moved across the room with the systematic assessment of someone evaluating both technique and potential. But it was the way Chef Bernard's entire demeanor changed that told the real story. The theatrical confidence vanished, replaced by the kind of respectful attention that suggested this visitor outranked everyone in the building by considerable margin. "Master Dubois," Chef Bernard said, his voice carrying a note of deference I'd never heard before. "We weren't expecting you until next week." "Plans changed," the older man replied in accented English, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without raising volume. "I wanted to observe your students before our final evaluation session." He moved through the room with unhurried steps, examining each student's work with the kind of detailed attention that made people nervous even when they had nothing to hide. At Sarah's station, he spent several minutes studying her color work and technique, asking questions about her background and experience that she answered with visible nervousness. At Amanda's workspace, he examined her portfolio with professional interest, noting the progression of complexity in her designs and offering brief comments about composition and structural considerations that revealed his own extensive background. When he reached my corner station, his examination became more thorough than I'd expected. He studied my sugar work from multiple angles, testing the flexibility and translucency with gentle pressure that spoke of extensive experience with the medium. His questions were different too, more technical and specific than the casual inquiries he'd made at other stations. "These stress modifications in your sugar formula," he said, indicating subtle variations in my technique that most people wouldn't notice. "Where did you learn to adjust for humidity and temperature variables?" "Trial and error mostly," I replied, the same deflecting response I'd been using for weeks. "Working in different environments teaches you to adapt." He nodded slowly, but his expression suggested my explanation wasn't entirely satisfactory. He made some notes on a small pad he carried, then moved on to complete his circuit of the room. Master Dubois gathered the class for what Chef Bernard announced would be a special challenge, an opportunity for students to demonstrate their progress under the kind of professional pressure they might encounter in real commercial environments. Each student would have 2 hours to create a complete cake design incorporating multiple advanced techniques. The project specifications were demanding: a 3-tier structure with internal supports, decorated using at least 4 different piping techniques, incorporating both buttercream and sugar work, and finished to presentation standards that would be acceptable in high-end commercial applications. As students began their preparations, the room filled with focused intensity that was different from our usual classroom atmosphere. Everyone understood that this was an evaluation that mattered, that Master Dubois' assessment would carry weight beyond simple class grades. I approached the challenge with the same systematic methodology I applied to everything, planning my workflow to maximize efficiency while ensuring quality at every stage. The cake structures went together with professional precision, dowels positioned for optimal weight distribution, tiers aligned with mathematical accuracy. My decorating work developed with smooth efficiency, each technique flowing naturally into the next without wasted motion or hesitation. The piping patterns were classical but executed with the kind of control that suggested extensive experience. The sugar work complemented rather than competed with the other elements, demonstrating restraint and artistic judgment. Around me, other students were experiencing varying levels of success and stress. Sarah's ambitious design was pushing her technical abilities beyond their current limits, resulting in visible frustration as elements failed to perform as she'd envisioned. Amanda was managing better, her methodical approach serving her well under pressure, though the complexity of her design was requiring more time than the schedule allowed. Janet was struggling with timing issues, her improved piping technique not yet developed enough to work efficiently under deadline pressure. Several other students were making compromises, simplifying their designs to ensure completion within the allotted time. Master Dubois moved through the room like a silent inspector, observing technique and decision-making processes with the kind of attention that made every movement feel significant. He didn't offer guidance or corrections, just watched and made occasional notes that he kept to himself. When he paused at my station, his observation became more intense. He watched my sugar work technique with particular interest, noting modifications I was making automatically to account for environmental conditions. His questions were brief but pointed, revealing a depth of knowledge that went far beyond typical culinary school instruction. "This approach to structural engineering," he said quietly, "this is not something you learn from books or standard classes. Where exactly did you develop these techniques?" "Professional kitchens teach you things classrooms can't," I replied, continuing my work without breaking rhythm. "You adapt or you fail." His expression suggested he found my explanation interesting. He made some notes on a small pad he carried, then moved on to complete his circuit of the room. Master Dubois gathered the class for what Chef Bernard announced would be a special challenge, an opportunity for students to demonstrate their progress under the kind of professional pressure they might encounter in real commercial environments. Each student would have 2 hours to create a complete cake design incorporating multiple advanced techniques. The project specifications were demanding: a 3-tier structure with internal supports, decorated using at least 4 different piping techniques, incorporating both buttercream and sugar work, and finished to presentation standards that would be acceptable in high-end commercial applications. As students began their preparations, the room filled with focused intensity that was different from our usual classroom atmosphere. Everyone understood that this was an evaluation that mattered, that Master Dubois' assessment would carry weight beyond simple class grades.
I approached the challenge with the same systematic methodology I applied to everything, planning my workflow to maximize efficiency while ensuring quality at every stage. The cake structures went together with professional precision, dowels positioned for optimal weight distribution, tiers aligned with mathematical accuracy. My decorating work developed with smooth efficiency, each technique flowing naturally into the next without wasted motion or hesitation. The piping patterns were classical, but executed with the kind of control that suggested extensive experience. The sugar work complemented rather than competed with the other elements, demonstrating restraint and artistic judgment. Around me, other students were experiencing varying levels of success and stress. Sarah's ambitious design was pushing her technical abilities beyond their current limits, resulting in visible frustration as elements failed to perform as she'd envisioned. Amanda was managing better, her methodical approach serving her well under pressure, though the complexity of her design was requiring more time than the schedule allowed. Janet was struggling with timing issues, her improved piping technique not yet developed enough to work efficiently under deadline pressure. Several other students were making compromises, simplifying their designs to ensure completion within the allotted time. Master Dubois moved through the room like a silent inspector, observing technique and decision-making processes with the kind of attention that made every movement feel significant. He didn't offer guidance or corrections, just watched and made occasional notes that he kept to himself. When he paused at my station, his observation became more intense. He watched my sugarwork technique with particular interest, noting modifications I was making automatically to account for environmental conditions. "This approach to structural engineering," he said quietly, indicating my tier assembly method, "this is not something you learn from books or standard classes."
Master Dubois called for time and began his final evaluation circuit, examining each completed project with detailed attention. His feedback was professional and constructive, acknowledging strengths while noting areas for improvement in language that suggested extensive teaching experience. At Sarah's station, he complimented her artistic vision while noting that ambitious designs required technical foundations that could only be developed through extensive practice. At Amanda's workspace, he praised her systematic approach while suggesting that efficiency would improve with experience. When he reached my corner station, his evaluation became notably more thorough. He examined every aspect of the cake with professional attention, testing structural integrity, evaluating decorative consistency, and assessing presentation standards with the kind of scrutiny that suggested this was more than casual academic interest. "Outstanding technical execution," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of professional respect that hadn't been present in his other evaluations. "This work demonstrates training and experience significantly beyond typical hobby level." He paused, studying me with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial assumptions about the quiet student in the corner. "I'm curious about your background," he continued. "This level of competence doesn't develop without extensive professional experience. What exactly is your current position?" "I work in food service," I replied, the same vague response I'd been using for weeks. "Various projects, different clients." His expression sharpened with interest. What kind of clients required this level of technical precision and presentation standards? Before I could formulate another deflecting response, his phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated priority communications. He answered immediately, his conversation brief and professional but clearly urgent. "Master Dubois, this is Director Phillips from the Presidential Birthday Commission. We need immediate confirmation of your status for tomorrow's preparations. The advance team needs to coordinate final logistics with your head decorator." The room went absolutely silent. Every conversation stopped, every movement paused, as the significance of what they'd just heard registered with stunning clarity. Master Dubois glanced around the room at the suddenly frozen faces, then looked directly at me with an expression that had shifted from professional interest to knowing recognition. "Director Phillips," he said into the phone while maintaining eye contact with me, "I'm currently reviewing final preparations with my lead decorator. We'll be ready for tomorrow's timeline as scheduled." He ended the call and the silence in the room became profound. Sarah's face had gone pale. Amanda stood motionless, her portfolio forgotten in her hands. Janet was staring with obvious confusion, trying to process what she'd just witnessed.
Chef Bernard cleared his throat nervously, clearly as surprised as his students by this unexpected revelation. Master Dubois, I had no idea about the connection to the Presidential Commission. This certainly explains the level of expertise we've been observing. Master Dubois smiled slightly, his gaze never leaving my face. Indeed, though I think perhaps our lead decorator has been enjoying a bit of anonymity during these sessions. Every eye in the room turned to me, the quiet woman in the corner who had just been identified as someone whose work was deemed suitable for presidential events. The casual dismissiveness of the past 3 weeks evaporated instantly, replaced by shocked recognition of how completely they had misread the situation. "I've been asked to maintain a low profile during my time here," I said simply, acknowledging the inevitable end of my careful anonymity. "But the learning experience has been valuable in its own way." Sarah found her voice first, though it came out smaller than usual. "You work for the Presidential Birthday Commission, making cakes for the White House?" "Among other things," I replied. "It's specialized work that requires particular attention to detail and security protocols." The questions began flooding in then, everyone suddenly desperate to understand how they had so completely misjudged the expertise of their quiet classmate. How long had I been doing this work? What was it like creating cakes for presidential events? Had I ever met the president personally? I answered what I could while maintaining the discretion that my position required, explaining the rigorous standards and security clearances necessary for White House culinary work. The technical precision they'd observed wasn't artistic showmanship. It was the minimum acceptable standard for events where failure wasn't merely disappointing, it was a national security concern. Amanda was shaking her head in obvious disbelief. "All those times you offered suggestions, and we ignored them. All those techniques you demonstrated that we thought were just lucky guesses." "Not lucky," I said, "just developed under circumstances where precision isn't optional." Janet approached with the kind of reverent awe that people reserved for meeting celebrities, though her expression carried genuine gratitude along with the surprise. "That piping technique you taught me," she said quietly, "you probably use that for presidential cakes, don't you?" "Every technique has its applications," I replied. "What matters is understanding when and how to use them effectively." Master Dubois was watching this interaction with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that his surprise evaluation had revealed something unexpected about his own teaching environment. "This has been quite illuminating," he said, addressing the room, but keeping his attention focused on me. "It's rare to have the opportunity to observe a professional of this caliber working in academic conditions." He turned to Chef Bernard, who was still processing the implications of having unknowingly hosted a presidential decorator in his advanced hobby class. "Your students have been privileged to work alongside someone whose expertise represents the highest levels of our profession. I trust they'll remember this experience when they continue their own development." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of questions, explanations, and the gradual adjustment to a completely altered understanding of who had been sharing their classroom for the past 3 weeks.
Students who had dismissed my suggestions were suddenly asking for detailed explanations of techniques they'd previously ignored. Sarah wanted to know about the color theory principles used in official state functions. Amanda was fascinated by the logistics of creating cakes that met both aesthetic and security requirements. Janet asked for additional guidance on techniques that would help her develop more professional-level capabilities. I answered what I could while maintaining appropriate discretion about specific procedures and security protocols. The technical aspects were shareable, but the operational details of presidential events remained classified regardless of the circumstances. As the evening concluded and students began cleaning their stations, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The casual dismissiveness had been replaced by respectful attention. The amateur assumptions transformed into recognition of expertise they'd been too limited in their thinking to recognize initially. Master Dubois approached my station as I completed my usual methodical cleanup routine, his expression carrying professional respect mixed with obvious curiosity about how I'd ended up in this particular situation. "I have to ask," he said quietly, "what brought someone of your caliber to a hobby-level decorating class?" "Continuing education," I replied, wiping down my workspace with the same efficiency I applied to everything else. "You can always learn something new, regardless of the environment."
He nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, though I suspect your classmates learned more than you did during these sessions. Different kinds of learning happen in different environments, I said, packing my tools with familiar precision. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected sources. As I prepared to leave Margot's Culinary Academy for what would likely be the final time, the other students offered a mixture of appreciation, apology, and requests for future guidance that I deflected with professional courtesy. The drive home took me through the same city streets, but the evening's revelation had changed something fundamental about the experience. The careful anonymity I'd maintained for 3 weeks was gone, replaced by recognition that would make returning to simple hobby classes impossible. Tomorrow would bring the return to familiar professional demands, presidential events that required the full scope of my training and experience. But tonight had served as a reminder of why teaching had originally attracted me. The satisfaction that came from helping people discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The quiet woman in the corner had been revealed for who she actually was, and the assumptions that had shaped 3 weeks of interactions had been completely overturned. It was a familiar pattern, one that repeated itself whenever people learned to look beyond appearances and recognize competence regardless of how it was packaged. Sometimes the most important lessons were the ones nobody expected to learn. The following morning brought a return to familiar routines and professional standards that operated by completely different rules than hobby classes at culinary academies. I arrived at the secure facility before dawn, badge scanned through 3 different checkpoints, and entered the sterile preparation kitchen where presidential events took their final form. The workspace bore no resemblance to Margot's Culinary Academy. Every surface gleamed under specialized lighting designed for color accuracy. Temperature and humidity were controlled to precise specifications. The equipment represented the highest levels of professional capability, calibrated and maintained to standards that eliminated variables rather than adapting to them. My team was already in position, their movements coordinated through years of working together, under conditions where excellence wasn't aspirational, it was mandatory. Each member had been selected for specific expertise and security clearance, their capabilities tested in real-world situations where failure carried consequences far beyond disappointed clients. The cake taking shape under our collective effort demonstrated techniques that went far beyond anything taught in civilian cooking schools. Structural engineering that could support elaborate designs while meeting transportation and security requirements. Decorative work that photographed perfectly under presidential lighting conditions. Flavor profiles developed through extensive testing with dietary specialists and security personnel. As I worked, muscle memory took over, my hands moving with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of practice under circumstances where every detail mattered. The piping work flowed with mechanical consistency, each element positioned according to specifications that had been reviewed and approved through multiple levels of oversight. The sugar work required particular attention, not just for aesthetic reasons, but for practical considerations that would never occur to civilian decorators. Every component had to meet specific durability standards for transportation and handling. Colors had to remain stable under television lighting. Structural elements needed to maintain integrity through hours of exposure without climate control. My colleagues worked with similar efficiency, their own specializations contributing to a final product that represented collaborative expertise rather than individual artistic expression. The florist who created edible arrangements understood both botanical accuracy and security screening requirements. The structural engineer who designed internal supports calculated load distribution and transportation stress factors. This was professional work in its purest form, where individual creativity served larger purposes and personal recognition was subordinated to mission success. The satisfaction came not from praise or acknowledgement, but from the knowledge that every element would perform exactly as intended under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The final assembly process followed protocols developed through years of experience with presidential events. Each component was inspected according to specific criteria, tested for stability and appearance under various conditions, and approved through systematic review that eliminated any possibility of failure during actual presentation. By midday, the completed cake stood ready for transport, its appearance representing the convergence of artistic vision and technical expertise that defined presidential-level culinary work. Every decorative element served multiple purposes, contributing to both visual impact and practical functionality that would maintain through extended exposure. The delivery process involved coordination with security personnel, transportation specialists, and event coordinators, whose collective expertise ensured seamless execution of the final presentation. My role continued through setup and final positioning, making adjustments for lighting conditions and photographic requirements that were unique to presidential events. Standing in the background during the actual celebration, I watched familiar faces enjoy the results of work they would never fully understand or appreciate. The president's genuine delight with the final presentation validated months of preparation and planning, though the recognition that mattered most came from colleagues who understood the complexity of what had been achieved. Later that evening, driving home through the same city streets that had carried me to and from Margot's Culinary Academy, I reflected on the contrast between civilian assumptions and professional realities. The quiet woman in the corner had returned to her natural environment, where competence was measured by results rather than appearances, and where expertise spoke for itself without need for explanation or validation. The experience at the Culinary Academy had served its purpose, providing perspective on how skills developed in specialized environments translated to civilian contexts. But it had also reinforced the understanding that true professional capability existed independently of recognition or acknowledgement from people who lacked the background to appreciate its significance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and different projects, each requiring the same systematic approach and technical precision that had marked tonight's presidential event. The quiet professional would continue her work in environments where excellence was expected rather than exceptional, where competence was assumed rather than surprising. Some lessons were best learned through experience rather than explanation, and some expertise was most effective when it operates without drawing attention to itself. The most dangerous people, after all, rarely announce themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.